Hello, everyone, and can I start by warmly welcoming you to today's session to our international webinar when we're considering how best to promote gender diversity internationally. By way of introduction, I'm Helen Farr. I'm a partner based here in the Taylor Wessing London office, and it's wonderful to welcome you all. I'm delighted to be here and chairing today's session. Now, one of the great advantages of the COVID pandemic is that we're able to be joined today by a team internally and obviously all of you who are joining us globally. So it's wonderful to have such a global and international audience. And we really do hope that you're going to find today really stimulating and thought-provoking, because our objective is to give you loads of ideas that you can take back to your businesses wherever you are in the world, and take some steps and encouragement to promote and improve gender diversity in your part of the world. And of course, it's particularly pertinent for us to be discussing these issues so close to International Women's Day, which is only 4 days away on the 8th of March. And the theme for this year's event is the importance that we all maintain that pressure and maintain the challenge for change. But of course, this year it's particularly challenging for all of us because of the impact of COVID. And what a time when strong leadership is so important. But it's slightly depressing to note that at the current rate of progress, gender equality across heads of government and in leadership roles in a public leadership sense is estimated to take 130 years. Women are still being paid less globally. And if you look at the task teams that were working on the COVID-19 across 87 countries, only 3.5% of those task teams internationally had gender parity, which is clearly far too low. But where women lead, we see amazing results, and some of the most efficient and best results to the COVID pandemic have been led by women. And that's why I believe that promoting gender diversity remains as important as ever. And it's wonderful that you can be here today to join our debate with our team, who are also incredibly passionate about this event. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to start by looking at how Taylor Wessing, as an international business, is tackling the issue of promoting gender diversity. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Elaine Dobson, who is the head of our UK residential property team, but also holds the incredibly important role of the chair of our Balance in Business Committee. Now, Elaine's going to be talking about some of the ways that Taylor Wessing is tackling this issue to give food for thought that we can all use in our businesses. Now, the vast majority of you I know work in global businesses, and we're then going to move on to hear from our international team, who will be looking at some of the steps taken across the world. We're going to start here in the UK and end up in Hong Kong via mainland Europe and Dubai, with some food for thought in terms of steps that have been taken across the world. Finally, last but absolutely by no means least, we're going to get the business perspective. And I'm particularly excited to be joined today by Martina Seidel, who is the Group Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at Difc Employment Law, and Ranjani Kearsley, who is the Head of HR at 8 Roads, which is part of the Fidelity Group. Both of them have international facing roles, and they've got a really good insight into these issues. And of course, we want today to be really useful for all of you. So please do use the chat box, fire questions in. There'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. And we will be finishing promptly in an hour and a half's time, because I appreciate how busy your time is at this moment. Finally, please stay on mute and keep your video off. So we wanted to start by talking about the Taylor Wessing approach to inclusion. And I think it's really important to stress that at Taylor Wessing, we have the requirement to promote and develop gender diversity and diversity generally as a core strategy of our business. And it's a business requirement. It's not a nice to have. It's essentially, it underpins our decision making. And that's really reinforced by the fact that we have a D&I partner who sits on our board, who gives that sense check to all decisions that are made that impact the business. And supporting her, we've got a D&I committee, and that meets every quarter and oversees our progress against objectives and our approach generally. And then, of course, we have various networks and committees looking at inclusion generally. And a key part of that is the Balancing Business committee, which Elaine chairs. But we recognise that inclusion is not just about gender, it's much broader than that. And there are unique issues that impact on people that fall within different categories, in particular women of colour, and we're very sensitive to those issues and are very keen to keep making progress. And on that note, that's a great time for me to introduce Elaine. Elaine, as I've said, is the chair of our Balancing Business Committee, and I'd like to start by asking Elaine to explain what is the Taylor Wessing gender plan. Thanks, Elaine.
Thanks, Helen. Hello, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you today. So Taylor Wessing recognised, as with a lot of other law firms, that at entry level, we have a very good balance of men and women coming into the profession. In fact, actually, at the moment, and I think for most of the law firms around the world, we actually see more women coming in at graduate level into the profession. However, as with most businesses, that balance falls away as women rise through the ranks towards more executive or leadership roles. And we are, in particular, about 5 years ago, decided to look at the reasoning behind it and what we could do to change our way of encouraging women to stay within the firm, and also encouraging women, particularly we focused on the partnership, but I'll explain why later. This ran in parallel with our clients and stakeholders who were demanding that their law firms reflected their own culture. And so we set out a plan as to what we could do. And you'll see on the slide that these are the principal reasons we decided that we needed a gender plan. But one of the other issues that we had is we had a gender group, but actually it was called Women in Business. And by its very name, it was excluding our male colleagues and our male stakeholders. So we changed the name of the group to Balance in Business, because that's exactly what we want to promote. We want to promote a balanced working environment, both internally and externally facing, so that we actually reflected our clients and what we wanted to see within the firm itself. So we looked at what can we do to attract more women to Taylor Wessing and retain our top female talent. Now, the two criteria that came into that were both role models that people could see, and also mentoring programs. So I think those were the key criteria that we worked on. And in identifying what Taylor Wessing could do, we had to drill down a little bit further. It wasn't just about bringing more women in, it was giving them the right opportunities to grow within the firm and to provide the right experience for our clients and also for our employees.
Thanks, Elaine. And what's Taylor Wessing been doing to actually move the dial on those issues?
Well, as I say, we looked at three sort of key areas where we thought we needed to focus our attention. The first one being talent attraction, promotion and retention strategies. The second one being work allocation and leadership opportunities. And the third, which is probably slightly ironic in today's world, flexibility and agile working. If I look at the first one, which is talent attraction, promotion and retention, what we found is, and I hate to generalize, but it's true, is that we found some of our male associates would always be the first ones to put up their hand up for any opportunity. Women in general, and it is a generalization, but it is true, tend to want to be recognized for the work that they do. And they are almost waiting for the tap on the shoulder. So we actually looked at how can we get women, how can we sponsor women in a way to put themselves forward. And that's exactly what we did. We looked at the sponsorship program that we have within Taylor Wessing. Now, sponsorship isn't something you can ask for. It is actually something that probably goes on all the time, but a lot of people don't recognize it happens. We also looked at our senior women mentoring our younger women. And then we realized actually that wasn't the right way around. So we asked some of our senior men to actually sponsor, mentor our younger associate women. We then looked at our talent pool, and we particularly looked at those associates and senior associates that we recognized as being crucial, could be very good partners, and we made sure that they had the support around them and gave them the confidence to be able to put their hands up and go forward. So that took care of the retention, but how do we then attract female talent? Well, actually, if the figures move and Taylor Wessing are seen to be not just ticking boxes, but actually doing what they say, then the attraction of a female talent was actually, it's a bit of an easy win. One of the other things that we did was look at the recruitment and our recruitment consultants. Now, recruitment consultants, as everybody knows, are driven by results. So we said to them, okay, do not come to us unless you have either a balanced portfolio of potential candidates, or you have gone out there and specifically targeted women candidates. Because otherwise, all that happens is there are some easy wins, and these are the only people in that you can possibly look at. And we found that that wasn't the case. So we were quite happy to wait for a longer period of time, so that we had a balanced pool of candidates to come into our lateral hire program. So once they're in, what do we do? And once we've got our female talent line, what do? We have to make sure that there are opportunities for them in leadership roles, and also that all of the work allocation for all those interesting pieces of work, client interfacing, whatever it is on a daily basis, is equally shared between all of our associates and senior associates, and even partners. So again, as with recruitment, we made sure that any leadership opportunities within the firm were targeted at a balanced pool of candidates. So it couldn't just be the last person that did a great job, or the last person you worked with. It had to be somebody who was actually right for the role, who had the skill set. So that was a big game changer, and we've seen that give our women associates and our women senior associates and junior partners the confidence to be able to put themselves forward for other roles within the firm. And then we had flexibility and agile working. Well, this last year has been a bit of a forced experiment in agile and flexible working. We all know that women take on more of the caring roles, and that has come to light probably as well as obviously the forced experiment on agile working in this last year. But what we have found is that women can work flexibly, and in fact our junior male lawyers are almost demanding that they can have that ability as well, to work flexibly and agilely, because they want to be fully involved with their domestic life, whatever that domestic life is, whether it's being a partner, whether it's in the domestic sense, whether it's a father, whether it's a carer of parents, whatever it might be, they want that ability as well. And the number of male candidates that come to us at associate level and ask us what our shared parental leave policy is, what our paternity leave policy is, which you never used to hear except from women who were wanting to know what the maternity leave is. So it is just as important to our men. And if the men can promote it, then the women feel included. So I think on the last point, what we have found is a lot of the doomsayers that say, especially on a transactional basis, that you can't work flexibly and you can't work agilely, that myth has been put to bed. And however much we'd all like to work back in the office, I think it's fair to say that some of our male colleagues, as well as our female colleagues, actually will not adopt back to 5 days in the office, and it works.
Thanks, Elaine. It's all well and good, obviously, having this plan, but is it really working? How are things going within the firm?
So I've put up the TWUK statistics, which go back to 2018. I will, hand on heart, say, thankfully, we can't see the 2016 figures, which were which were quite a lot less, actually. It was about 14%. So you can see in 5 years that we've grown our female partnership to 24.2%. In fact, it is actually slightly higher than that, because we've promoted, the last promotion round brought in a couple of female partners into the partnership. What I would say is our original gender plan was principally around bringing women into the partnership, or up through into the partnership. So that's why we focused on these figures. But at all levels up to partnership, it is pretty 50-50. We are doing really well. And the board, I'm pleased to say, have absolutely 100% backed us on this. And it is, as you have said, one of the core strategies of the Taylor Wessing business plan going forward. It's diversity, but more importantly, inclusion. It's all very well having numbers, but is it really inclusive? That it is extremely important to the board, and it's extremely important to our clients. And I don't know one big pitch now that doesn't require you to have your statistics on display.
Thanks, Elaine. That's a really helpful and insightful oversight in terms of what we're doing at Taylor Wessing.
My pleasure.
Thank you. That's great. I'm now going to move on to look at, away from what we're doing in Taylor Wessing as a business, to consider what countries are doing and how various jurisdictions are tackling the need to promote gender diversity. We're going to show that there's some great ideas, but of course things still need to improve. And I'm going to start with Claudia, who's a partner in our French team. Now in France. Hi, Claudia. Great to see you. Hi. So in France, I know that the French government has taken quite a radical approach to the use of quotas as a way to promote gender equality. Are you able, Claudia, to talk us through the steps taken in France and the impact that that's had?
With pleasure, Helen.
Thank you.
France was the first European country to implement quotas. It is interesting to see why and how France implemented such legislation. I would like to have a quick look on the evolution of women's rights and their position on the French labor market to give you an idea where we come from. Indeed, the right for women to vote exists in France since 1945, and the principle of equality in all areas between men and women figures in the French Constitution since 1946. But in fact, until 1965, women could not work without their husband's authorization. Women could not open a bank account, and they could not dispose of their property. Today, 68% of women between 15 and 64 work in France, which is a slightly higher rate than the average rate for women in the EU, which is 62%. Female workers are, however, 4 times more on part-time jobs than men and are less represented in certain scientific and industrial sectors. Moreover, there is a remaining average pay gap of about 17%. So, observing that women could not easily obtain leadership positions, France has introduced already 10 years ago legislation which allow, on the basis of EU law, positive discrimination in favor of women. And EU legislation indeed allows such kind of quota-based legislation in favor of women as long as the measures taken appear being proportional and aiming efficiently at gender equality. So a law called Copé-Zimmermann imposed in 2011 a mandatory rate of 40% of women on boards of directors to be obtained until 2017, which different thresholds, applying now to all companies over 250 employees. This change has had a significant impact on boards of companies listed on the stock exchange and bigger organizations. Indeed, 44% of women are on boards of directors of companies with more than 500 employees now. This represents an increase from 10% to 44% in 10 years. So there are really good examples of companies listed on the stock exchange in France, like Engie, SPIE, Ipsos, Vivendi, which do have more than 50%, a real majority of women on their boards. And France is therefore ranked at the first place in the EU and second worldwide behind Iceland.
I mean, Claudia, that's brilliant, isn't it? That really does show the power to make changes through legislation. But are you able to talk us through why you think that's worked so effectively?
Yes, sure. First, I think there are real legal sanctions which exist. For example, the board deliberations are null and void, and director fees can't be paid out in case of infringement of quotas. Second, the board of directors is a supervisory institution, and the decision makers in bigger organizations serve on executive committees. It is possibly easier to let women have access to supervisory roles, even at high level, rather than to top management positions. So there is still some need for progress. Bigger organizations seem to hire externally the perfect women for board positions, where smaller companies rely more on internal promotions. But there are only 4 out of 10 French companies which have specific policies or a strategy in place focusing on recruitment and promoting of female executives. And French headhunters, specialized in the research of female candidates, pretend that the absence of internal candidates explains that in small companies under 500 employees, women only represent 22% on boards of directors. Nevertheless, the findings are clear. The legislation on quota was necessary and needed to improve gender diversity on boards of directors. And to extend the gender diversity to top management positions, quota-based legislation will also be unavoidable. Under discussion is a legal proposal imposing a mandatory rate of 40% of women on ExComs to be obtained until 2024, applying to companies over 500 employees, where women currently represent less than 20%. And when they are on executive committees, they are often in HR or communication positions. Only 4% appear to hold business-related positions. France is behind Germany here, which has already formalized a law proposal for a female quota in leadership positions for big German organizations. Well, the French employers' organizations are frankly against female quota for executive management positions. They argue that such measure represents an excessive interference of government measures with business. They want freely agreed quota for women depending on the sector of activity, saying that there are not enough candidates in some industries, as the scientific and industrial sector, for example. There are also discussions on the necessity of quota-based legislation relating to the recruitment of female executives, as the lack of competent women remains the major pretext for not pushing more gender diversity. One proposal is to introduce legislation to assure that the number of executives equals at least the proportion which women represent amongst the graduates. Another is legislation requiring that half of all applicants for a particular employment be female.
Thanks, Claudia. That's great. It's really good to see how things are developing in France, but clearly there's some way to go. And I'm sure it'd be good to have another discussion in a few years' time to see how things are developing there. I'm now going to move away from France to the Netherlands and ask Rose, who's a lawyer in our Dutch team, to talk about ways that other European countries are trying to level the playing field. And I understand, Rose, that in the Netherlands, the Dutch government has reconsidered its family leave policies and how they can be used to promote diversity. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Helen. That's right, what you just explained. In the Netherlands, we have a system where there's a relatively short period of maternity leave for women after the birth of their child. They have a total of 16 weeks, where they usually take 12 weeks after birth. And during this period of time, there's a protection against dismissal, so employers cannot dismiss them. And during this maternity leave, they usually get full paid. After this period of maternity leave, they get the working mothers get back to work, and until July 2020, partners of women only had 5 days of partner leave, only 5 days after birth. From 2020, the system has changed, and this partner leave was increased with 5 extra weeks, so with a total of 6 weeks. Obviously, this is still quite unequal, so to say. And research shows that if men are from birth involved with raising the children and taking care of them, this contributes to an equal division of care of their children. So at this moment in time, we see that partly due to this system, many women in the Netherlands work part-time. And it's only women who are temporarily out of the working system for a longer period of time, and men are not. And this also, of course, creates inequality with regard to making a career within companies if women are absent for a longer period of time. So we also see that due to this system, salaries of women stay behind with an average of 39% in the first 8 years after birth of the first child. And this is also called the child penalty, which is quite shocking to me, and very severe, of course. So if we look at this all together, we see a situation of inequality, and although I do think that the Netherlands is a very progressive country on several topics, we do see that the role allocation is still old-fashioned. And I do think that this is caused, at least partly caused, by the current system we have, because also, as Elaine explained in the beginning, I do think that men do want to be part of the and take part in the domestic roles and do want to be part of taking care for the children, but this is just or mainly due to the system we have in the Netherlands. And given this current situation, it's very important that companies are aware of this situation and encourage men to take more part in childcare and create possibility for women to work more, work full time, or at least more hours they work now, especially since we do not have real diversity quota yet. So a measure such as extending partner leave, but also women leadership programs, sponsorship programs, or mentoring roles, as Elaine explained as well, are diversity measures which could really help within the companies, and could eventually create equality and encourage women to take leadership roles. So although the situation is not as good as I wish it would be, I do think that there's more and more awareness of this problem or diversity issue, and there is a culture change. So I do think we can make it happen if we all take the measures we need to take and are aware of this issue and spread the word, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Rose. That's great, and it's really wonderful. It's really important, I think, to highlight, that child penalty that I think so many women face by the decision, as soon as they have a family. And it's great to hear that although things are taking some time in the Netherlands, things are improving. Thank you. We're now going to move to to Germany, and I'm going to ask Katja, who's a partner in the German team, to talk to us a little bit about gender diversity reporting. And I know for those of you who are based in the UK, I'm sure you'll be dealing with your UK gender reporting requirements at the moment. But the situation, as I understand it, Katja, is a little bit different to this point, and that in Germany, employees are able to actually make specific requests about their pay data. Are you able to tell us a little bit about how sort of that reporting works in Germany and how that's developed?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Helen. Yeah, so the background of our reporting system is basically our huge gender pay gap in Germany. We have a gender pay gap of 19% between the average of what women earn and of what men earn. And even if you adjust this gender pay gap and take out all adverse factors like industry or less experience due to childcare or all these factors, there still remains a gender pay gap of 7%. So 7%, which women are paid less for the same job and the same experience and qualification. Of course, this is unlawful in Germany for quite some years. Especially we have an Equal Treatment Act since 2006. So the problem must lie deeper here. And in fact, it is a lack of information of women. So many women even don't know that they are discriminated against or that they are being actually paid less than men in the same role. So what the German legislator actually did is to try to fill that gap of information and give women a chance to get information on what men are paid in equal positions. So since 2017, there is an entitlement to receive certain information on what men in equal positions are paid. This law was first hugely criticized, and many people said that it wouldn't tackle the issue since the information is worthless and is not enough to help women to file for equal pay or anything. But actually, these people have proved wrong. In January of this year, the German Federal Labor Tribunal has ruled that the information provided on this request, if this information hints to men being better paid than women, then this will suffice to shift the burden of proof in an equal pay litigation. So if we really receive information that shows that men might earn more than a woman, the woman no longer has to prove anything, but it will now be the employer who has to explain the remuneration system and why this specific difference in pay is there and why it is not discriminatory. I think this is a huge step forward in Germany, where we have very few litigation on equal pay or discrimination because it has just proved very unsuccessful in the past. You might ask now whether this threats employers, and I think the answer is no, because as long as employers have a system in place and know why they pay what remuneration to which employee and what are the criteria, then there is nothing to fear. So I don't think that this is really something to punish employers, but to really support women in helping them to get their equal pay.
Thanks, Katie. That's fantastic, and it's really interesting to show the power that a change in law can have, because obviously moving the burden of proof in that way, so that as soon as there is a pay difference shown, it's for the employer to show why that pay difference is justified, is a really dramatic step, and it's something that I think other countries and other jurisdictions could really do be great to emulate that. So thank you. That's a really good point that you make there. I'm now going to move away from Germany, but and to Austria. And one of the biggest impacts that we've seen with the lack of gender diversity is the disparate impact that the lack of sort of equality has on a woman's financial position. And obviously we've spoken a little bit about that when Rose was talking about the impact of taking time out for caring responsibilities. In Austria, the question was to ask about the steps that the Austrian government is considering to improve the potentially disparate impact that gender's had on pension. And are you able to give us some more information about that, please, Brigitte?
Yes, of course. Let me give you an outline of the situation in Austria. Actually, in Austria, the pension situation is quite peculiar. Like several other European countries, such as Belgium, Italy, or Poland, Austria provides for a different retirement age for men and women. Men are entitled to old age pension after having reached their 65th birthday, whereas women can already retire at the age of 60. It is still a long way to go until the retirement ages will be harmonized, actually. According to the present laws, it will only be in 2033 that women also have to wait until their 65th birthday in order to be able to retire. From time to time, there are voices actually raised which call for an acceleration of the harmonization. However, actually, it doesn't seem as if change in the law is going to happen. Although harmonization of the different retirement ages will not be accomplished soon, there are other areas in which the Austrian highest court already followed the legal opinion of the European Court of Justice, according to which a differentiation in age is usually discriminatory. This in peculiar applies to terminations of employments by employers, which may not be justified by reaching the retirement age, even if the woman is already entitled to a statutory old age pension. Furthermore, contractual provisions which stipulate that the contract is automatically terminated upon reaching the retirement age are also invalid in Austria. This also leads to the consequence that any link to the retirement age, for example, in company pension plans or even in general collective agreements of the social partners, are most probably invalid. This is even the case if the rule leads to a more favorable treatment of women. Therefore, positive discrimination is not a valid reason. The relevant criteria is actually always whether the gender leads to a different treatment or whether any other arguments can be brought forward to justify any distinction. However, with regard to social plans, the situation seems to be a bit different. Such plans are usually concluded between the undertaking and the Works Council in order to mitigate the negative impacts which result from restructuring and therefore dismissals of a substantial number of employees. Such social plans often link to benefits to the entitlements under the state-paid pension in a way that benefits are stopped as soon as state pension is granted. The European Court of Justice, as well as the Austrian Highest Court, already ruled in this respect that such differentiation in terms of the age between men and women are not to be regarded as discriminatory. The reason is that such provisions of the social plan pursue the purpose to bridge the time until the statutory pension age. Therefore, men and women are not in the same position due to the different state pension systems and may consequently receive deviating bridging payments. Lastly, I would like to refer to another regulation that was implemented in 2005 in order to improve things for women by mitigating the differences in the actual state pensions received by men and women. These differences are seriously reinforced due to the high female unemployment rate and due to many periods when women are not paid to care for children. In 2005, therefore, the government introduced an option for pension splitting. Parents could and can currently agree on voluntary pension splitting for the years in which they raise their children, so that up to 50% of the income can be transferred to the pension account of the parent who cares for the children but doesn't earn any money. However, this voluntary option is hardly used and therefore did not lead to the desired effect of improvement of the pensions for women. The current government is therefore considering introducing pension splitting automatically in order to prevent old age poverty among women. It remains to be seen whether this intention is really turned into reality, especially in these turbulent times.
Thanks, Brigitte. That's really, really useful. And I think that concept of pension splitting, I really hope it's introduced into Austria. And also it's a fantastic idea that I think certainly other parts of the world should emulate too, because, you know, there's just too much evidence of women struggling financially as a result of the decisions that we've taken. So it's a fantastic development.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
Hi. Now, thanks, Aksa. Great to see you and hear you. I want to move over to Dubai, and obviously the position in Dubai is different because things are slowly getting better, or things are slowly improving for women. But can you talk us a little bit through those changes and how things are developing?
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen. First of all, I would just like to say that in terms of the legal changes that have been introduced, they are fairly, you could say, small, but we're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
And prior to these legal changes being introduced, basically there wasn't much protection for working women. It was quite limited, in particular in the case of onshore companies in the UAE. Benefits were predominantly just restricted to maternity leave as well as nursing breaks within the private sector. So, for instance, we've got in the UAE a 45 days, calendar days, that is, maternity leave under the UAE labour law for women working in the private sector. This is at full pay. That's the full 45 days if someone has worked for the organisation for a period of 12 months. And if it's less than 12 months continuity of service, then it's half pay, but they still get the 45 calendar days. In addition to this, women can actually claim 100 unpaid days of leave in the UAE. That's subject to them proving that they have suffered health-related difficulties as a result of giving birth or their pregnancy, and it needs to be approved by the employer, so it's not an automatic right. In contrast, you've got the public sector, where recently in Dubai they've introduced a 90 calendar days maternity leave. So it's the public sector is progressing a bit more rapidly than the private sector in terms of gender equality and diversity. Having said that, there have been certain private companies which have gone a step further and have introduced a more enhanced maternity leave internally. And for instance, the Isa Al Ghurq group, which is a very big group within the UAE of companies, has introduced a 90 days maternity leave for its employees. So more and more private sector companies are willing to now offer more than the minimum that's specified by the UAE labour law as far as the onshore position is concerned. Things are changing. There have been some key developments that have been made to the UAE labour law in 2020, so fairly recently, which show that there is a willingness to now basically enhance the gender diversity and equality within the workplace. And some of these changes are, for instance, equal pay. The UAE labour law has always had an equal pay provision, but now that has been recently enhanced in that it says that women and men who perform the same work or work of equal value should be paid equally. It's not very clear what constitutes work of equal value, and the authorities are currently looking at releasing some guidelines in relation to this aspect. Our understanding is that the market standards will be used as a reference in relation to wage assessments. So this is something that we are quite eagerly awaiting for the authorities to release. In relation to another big right that has been introduced recently, which protects women within the workplace, is protection from pregnant women being terminated. If it is the case that a woman is terminated because of her pregnancy, then she can claim compensation for arbitrary dismissal, which in the UAE labour law is a maximum of 3 months. There used to be a working hour restriction for particular industries where women were not allowed to perform nighttime shifts. That has now been removed. Women are also now allowed to work in hazardous environments and factories beyond 8 p.m. So that's been quite an interesting change. And these changes effectively show the UAE's commitment towards gender equality in the workplace. But given that these are fairly new changes, their actual impact on promoting gender equality is yet to be seen, but we're certainly going in the right direction. These steps may not be seen as being quite substantial when you compare it to what we have available in the Western jurisdictions. But nevertheless, it shows the UAE's commitment to change, to making changes in the right direction and better supporting women in the workplace. In relation, sorry, Helen? Yes.
Sorry, go ahead. No, sorry.
Yes. In relation to the DIFC employment law, there are different rules which effectively govern those employees who work within DIFC, and the DIFC law has changed since 2019. So some of the key family-friendly rights that have been introduced include female employees who return from their maternity leave will now be entitled to have a 1 hour nursing break per day for a period of 6 months. This is a right that is already available to onshore employees in the private sector, but for them it's a period of 18 months as opposed to 6 months. In addition, female employees who are adopting a child, if the child is under the age of 5 at the time of adoption, then they can also avail from the 65 working days maternity leave, which is applicable within the DIFC only. In regards to the discrimination claims, the protected characteristics have now been extended, and age and pregnancy have been introduced for the first time. The changes in the DIFC law further evidence that the UAE is taking small but progressive steps towards enhancing gender diversity. In relation to the Gender Balance Council, this is a council that was established in 2015. It's a federal entity which is responsible for developing and implementing gender diversity in the UAE, and that's across all different industries, including the workplace, education, and leadership roles, etc. So just looking at some facts and figures, women now make up 66% of the public sector workers in the UAE, with 30% leadership in leadership roles and 15% in technical and academic roles. About 75% of positions in education and the health sectors are occupied by women, which it has been a big improvement over the last 3 years. The UAE is more focused on educating both men and women. And recently, the rate of adult literacy for women in particular has been 31%. And today, the literacy rates for both genders are close to 95% in the UAE. These figures clearly show that there is a drive to improve gender diversity in the UAE, and that women are now willing to enter job markets which have historically been dominated more by male workers. So I think we're taking steps in the right direction, and it's always nice to see that.
Yeah, thanks, Axel. So obviously small steps, but at least things are moving in the right direction, which is great.
Yes,
moving, I just wanted to move across now to from Dubai to Hong Kong and introduce Mark, who is the managing partner of the Hong Kong office. Now, interestingly, for me, it seems that in Hong Kong, you have the least amount of regulation, and yet gender diversity seems to be flourishing. And I understand that a large part of that is because of the requirement that businesses have quotas and requiring a sort of a minimum number of female applicants. And Mark, can you give us some information about how effective that's been in practice and how you've seen quotas used?
Okay.
Hi, Mark.
Thanks, Helen. No, I thought that given the topic today on balance and diversity, it's interesting that I'm the only male representative, so that's a bit of diversity.
Welcome, thank you.
Yeah, and this also is a reflection of our Hong Kong office. Given that we do have predominantly females in the office. But unfortunately, that's as far as diversity goes. From a Hong Kong perspective, I think unfortunately, and very embarrassingly, I think Hong Kong lags behind all the presentations earlier in terms of actual legislation. There's just a complete lack of legislation in Hong Kong to protect the sort of gender diversity issues. I think in the past, what we have is really events on to raise awareness, peer pressure from sort of females, and this is significant enough to share, which is the fact that there was a video made by some of the top female business and law firm leaders, and that was actually cited as a very big step towards promoting women awareness. But that's as far as it got. But in early 2019, I think there was finally something that was taken forward as a step, and that was really driven on listed companies. I mean, given that Hong Kong is one of the largest stock exchanges in the world, I think that was where people thought might be a good place to start. So I think what we have introduced was that for all listed companies in Hong Kong, they have to include a diversity policy as part of its corporate governance. And essentially, the diversity policy is really driven at gender diversity. Now, unfortunately, if you were to breach it or you do not comply with it, there are almost no sanctions. I mean, it's really just a comply or explain requirement. And it's very easy for a lot of the boards to say that, look, it's just something that, we're looking at, we're trying to improve on. At the moment, we haven't found the right candidate, and so on and so forth. So if you looked at the numbers that we have, I think to date, women only represent about 13% of the directors for Hang Seng Index companies, being the top companies in Hong Kong. The thing that the exchange has tried to do, because there's only that much you can do about listed companies already. So what they've tried to do is, okay, let's look at new listing applicants. So anyone who wants to look at Hong Kong as a listing destination, and if you have a single gender board, you actually do need to explain a lot, and how are you going to achieve gender diversity? So the problem remains, how effective are all these soft policies? So, the examples that we can share, I mean, this is, real life examples of our clients. Hong Kong listed companies are very different from the ones that are listed in the US, for example, whereby a lot of them are, PRC companies, Chinese companies, and a lot of them are family owned. So one thing that we often see as this new requirement of having a female on the board is that the chairman would simply invite his wife to be, one of the executive directors.
Right.
And that, to them is like, this is how I solve the problem. And it's really difficult to write the bio because, she obviously doesn't run the business, but we do write in the fact that she has provided strategic advice over the years. And, that's as far as it gets.
Right.
We also have a client, which is, huge successful conglomerate, with mega businesses. And also as part of the diversity requirement, what they did was that they simply promoted the company secretary and said, look, you're now an executive director, so please be the female representation on the board. But, every time we do go for meetings, I mean, her role is nothing about being a director. It's still about, can you set up the conference call? Can you make sure everyone's online and all that stuff? So in that sense, again, it's really about, how effective is this? But look, it's really a very Asian mindset, and it took us only until last year before Hong Kong introduced a better sort of maternity leave plan for women, and that was really extended from 10 weeks to 14 weeks, and and that is also something I don't dare to share that much, given 14 weeks is nothing compared to what people get anywhere else. But there are sort of baby steps, and I think that's as far as it's gotten so far. And I think like what everyone said, there is some progress. I think there is raised awareness. I think people do realize that they do need to take this a bit more seriously. And hopefully, I think, we'll see more real progress. I think, the fact that people do take this and do come up with some sort of legislation, enforce more policies, and hopefully, I think, Hong Kong, instead of 13%, will get a little closer to what is sort of like an acceptable norm across the world. So that's sort of like the situation we have in Hong Kong right now.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark. That's great. And I love the idea of putting your wife on the board and saying that she provides strategic advice. I think that's fantastic. Thanks. And obviously, lots of progress needed, but at least things are slowly improving. And then finally, we wanted just to end with the position in the UK. And obviously, in the UK, we've had a lot of protection in place for women for some time, and I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Roxanne Davey, who's one of the senior associates in the UK team. And Roxanne, I started by talking about the impact of COVID, which is something that's impacting on all of us internationally. Can you tell us what, if anything, the impact of COVID has been on those rights?
Sure. So I think the most obvious immediate impact that it had was on gender pay reporting back in 2020 and also now in 2021. So by way of reminder, gender pay reporting was introduced in the UK in 2017, and businesses need to report on their gender pay gap by the 4th of April each year. So last year, shortly after lockdown was announced in England in March, the government suspended gender pay reporting for that year entirely due to the impact of COVID. Now, this was obviously met with some criticism, as by the time it was suspended, arguably most companies would have been ready to report anyway, or nearly very there. So there was a question as to whether or not it would have been better just to give them longer to report rather than suspending the obligation altogether. In the last week or so, the Equality and Human Rights Commission has also said that whilst the obligation to report still exists in 2021, companies that fail to meet that reporting deadline of the 4th of April will be given a 6-month reprieve before any enforcement action is taken. So essentially, they're extending the deadline for reporting for 6 months for this year as well. Now, that does seem a lot more proportionate, but these two changes together could suggest that gender pay reporting isn't really being considered a priority. And then there's a knock-on effect risk that this could undermine the process that's been made in introducing it in the first place. Linked to, oh, sorry.
I was going to, yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
And linked to that, we've had a recent report, the House of Commons Women and Equalities Committee report. The title is on the slide there, Unequal Impact, Coronavirus and the Gendered Economic Impact. It was published in early February. And it highlights how existing gendered inequalities in the economy have been perhaps ignored and even exacerbated by the pandemic policy response. So the committee has made a number of recommendations and conclusions, and the key ones, I'll summarise them quickly. But first of all, it's in relation to some of the schemes that the government introduced to help those whose jobs and income had been affected as a result of the pandemic. So we've got the CJRS and the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. And the report notes that they were a vital safety net introduced at the time, but ultimately that the design of these schemes has overlooked labour market and caring inequalities faced by women. In particular, the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme came under fire due to the disparate impact it had on women who'd taken maternity leave in the reference period. The report has asked the government to publish an equality impact assessment of those schemes alongside its response to the report. Other recommendations including making the right to request flexible working a day one right. So at the moment, employees need 26 weeks service to make that request, but under these proposals, an employee can make it on day one. Then to introduce legislation to extend redundancy protection to pregnant women and new mothers. So at the moment, redundancy protection is only extended to those actually on maternity leave. Linked to gender pay reporting, a recommendation to urgently reinstate that with reporting for the last financial year and this one required in April 2021. And also a recommendation that the EHRC explore whether or not they could report on parental leave policies and gender pay gaps in relation to furlough and redundancy for 2020 to 21 to assess the impact of the pandemic in those areas as well. They've also recommended that the government publish proposals for introducing not just gender pay, but ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting within the next 6 months. And then 2 final points are that the government amend the HR1 form, which, as many of us will know, is the form submitted by employers when they are proposing large-scale redundancies, and amend that to require information about the sex, race, and maybe other protected characteristics of staff that are at risk of redundancy. And finally, to publish the draft employment bill by the end of June 2021 and ensure that that takes into account the recommendations I've just run through. So the question remains whether or not the government will or will not make the changes. The timetable certainly seems quite ambitious, and there is a tension on the one hand between deregulation and the desire to remove red tape, and also accommodating some of these new challenges which have arisen as a result of the pandemic over the last year. So we'll need to see how the government will respond to this and which of these recommendations they'll take on board.
Yeah, thanks, Roxanne. I think that's really interesting because it'd be interesting to see how the government does respond and how much priority it actually gives to these changes, which I think are as important now as they ever were, given the impact of the pandemic on gender and women who really have borne the brunt of the caring and financial impact of this pandemic.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much. That's great. Thank you. Well, I'm now going to move on to the next part of our presentation, which is, as we said, we're going to be asking business leaders for their view. And we're delighted to be able to be joined this afternoon by 2 really inspirational leaders who are committed to promoting gender diversity within their businesses. And we have Martina Seidel, who is the Group Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at Sequin DeVrient, and Ranjani Kearsley, who's the Head of HR at 8 Roads, which is part of the Fidelity Group. And I'm going to ask you both, Ranjani and Martina, to introduce yourself briefly. And Martina, perhaps could I start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and I hope you can hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely. We can hear you brilliantly. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, my name is Martina Seidel. I'm responsible for legal compliance and data privacy for Difc and DeVrient Group. We are active in almost all countries of the world, actually. We provide solutions to secure payments and identities, both in the physical and in the digital world, actually. And we provide digital security and connectivity solutions as well. So quite exciting business areas that we're active in. But I started my career working in various legal roles with Fujitsu Siemens Computers, which was a joint venture of the Japanese tech giant Fujitsu and the German industry giant that you all know, Siemens. After Fujitsu acquired the full stake of the joint venture, I got promoted to general counsel of that business, which at that time formed the 2nd largest business unit in Fujitsu outside of Japan. So big role. And at that time, this was quite unusually, particularly in a Japanese corporation, as when I got promoted, I was rather young. I was in my late 30s. I was younger than most of my team, and I was a woman. I took the challenge, and I continued to take more challenges, and here I am today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Martina. That's great, and it's great that you can be here, and fantastic that you stepped up and took that challenge too. And now to introduce Ranjani. Perhaps Ranjani, would you be able to quickly introduce yourself as well? That's great.
Of course, happy to be here, and it's been amazing and very interesting to hear all of the different updates from the different countries. So, hi everyone, my name's Ranjani. As Helen said, I am currently the global head of HR for 8 Roads, which is a proprietary venture capital firm. I've been here for about 2 years, and before that, I was the head of HR for Fidelity International, which is as many of you will know, a global asset management company. It's very much an investment business. My career has always been in financial services, although I didn't start out in HR. I started out as a M&A analyst, and so investment and staying close to the markets has always been part of what I've absolutely loved. And particularly in the kind of times that we live in, seeing how the markets respond and seeing how global businesses respond, particularly now with my people and HR hat on, has been tremendously fascinating. So really looking forward to the discussion, Helen, and back to you.
Thanks, Ranjani. And actually, I'm going to ask you the first question, which is, obviously, you've worked throughout your career in senior HR roles in international organisations. And could you perhaps share your thoughts on what you've taken or what you think is the most successful step that you've seen taken to promote gender diversity across an international organisation?
Yeah, sure. So 2 aspects to it. Firstly, I'll refer back to what Elaine said at the very start of this seminar, which is how do you go about balance, which is a fantastic way, by the way, that I think you're looking at it at Taylor Wessing. I think what's really important, there's no one single successful step in my experience. You need a proper plan. And I think the plan builds on itself. Firstly, you need to be really realistic and honest about where a company is, whether you're being compliant, so you're keeping up with legislation, whether you're really committed because you understand the moral case, whether you're starting to develop your business case for diversity and starting to prove it, or whether you moved into tracking, measuring, exactly as I say, Elaine put up earlier on in the presentation. I think being very realistic about where you are and building that, soon you'll get to a stage where you can embed it into your processes and practices. So I think, first of all, you need to have a very concrete plan. And then when I speak to different boards about it, I say it's going to require the 3 Ds. It needs the discipline of measurement and tracking. It needs dedication to the cause, because this is a societal imperative, not just a business imperative. And then it needs a huge amount of dollars. It's amazing how many businesses will invest in technology and infrastructure and supply chains, when actually for many businesses like ours, the intellectual property we're in the trade of is people. And we tend to typically underinvest in people. And balance in business is an area where we do need to get boards to be serious and management teams to be serious about funding and investment. So I think having a concrete plan and approaching it like you would any business project is really key. And to your point around international policy, I would say, and all of you will know this, there is no one size fits all. I mean, people tend to think about Europe as this homogenous mess. Just listen to the presentations we've had and updates. It's not. Asia has its own set of challenges. I do think there is this sort of sweet spot between legislative framework and public policy, cultural context and tradition, and corporate policy. And sometimes we think of those 3 things in isolation, whereas where I've seen tremendous progress is where they all come together. And I think businesses in particular have a huge impact when it comes to campaigning, to having a voice and promoting their own ethos and talent and diversity. That makes a huge difference. But you can't do that divorced from the local tradition, the local culture and context, and the progressive environment that you operate in, because legislation has a huge impact. So I think it's those 3 things that really come together, and your diversity policy has to be sensitive to that context.
So based on that, Ranjani, do you think it's ever possible for a global business to adapt the same policy across the business?
I don't think you can have the same policy. You certainly can't have the same set of interventions, I think, in my mind. What you can have is a spirit. Every company has its own set of values, and the values are what really bind people. You can absolutely have a value or a set of values that says this is what we believe in passionately when it comes to our people. But how you put in place sensitive interventions in each country, in each location where you have offices or supply chains, will have to look markedly different. I'll give you a very small example. We've just gone through Pride Month, and we've been trying to promote LGBTQIA. It keeps going, which is fantastic. And we're all sharing our pronouns. So if you look at on Zoom calls or audio calls, people are being encouraged to share their pronouns. There are many countries across the developed and developing economies where homosexuality is still a criminal act. It hasn't been decriminalized yet. So when you're trying to put forward progressive diversity policies that is trying to increase representation for a group of people, trying to do that in environments which are not yet conducive to those efforts is a really difficult thing to do, and you can stray into cultural insensitivity. So I would say absolutely have the same set of values, but think very carefully about what interventions will have the most impact in every single jurisdiction or country you're in.
Thanks, Ranjani. Martina, we've heard a lot from obviously the legal side of things, but from the lawyers, and obviously you've got a legal and compliance role. From your experience working in that sort of business role, do you think we can rely on businesses to improve things voluntarily, or do you think we'll only really see change if businesses are forced to do so because of pressure, because of legislation from the top?
Well, although I wish it would be different, Helen, unfortunately, data showed that a little nudge by the legislator is necessary, as it seems, because let's take Germany as an example. Since the year 2010, 2011, there were actually several attempts in form of voluntary commitment campaigns initiated by the government together with industry to increase the number of women in top management roles. And part of these campaigns was also to introduce something that was called a flexible quota, which required companies to define their own quotas and to set quotas for themselves. So completely voluntary, but everybody was encouraged to do something. Unfortunately, the result of this campaign was not very ambitious because companies, and you won't believe it because it's so embarrassing, companies set quotas that ranged between 0 and 10%. And they did put 0 as a target quota. And obviously, this was not acceptable at all. So in 2015, the government initiated legislation that made quotas mandatory for at least for the supervisory board, so the non-executive roles, and they put 30% as a quota, a firm mandatory quota for the big stock-listed companies, and that became law. And in that legislation process, there was huge debate in the public, especially in the businesses in the industry, because there were huge concerns that there wouldn't be enough qualified women, that all these positions would remain vacant, companies would run into big problems because there wouldn't simply be not enough qualified women to fill these roles. The law, nevertheless, entered into force, and like this, board seats were filled. We had fantastic women, super qualified, and as of today, I think last number I heard was that there are 35% female board directors in the big companies in Germany. So it really required that little push. Today, 2021, the executive roles still are under this voluntary commitment, and unfortunately, today we still see very little progress here. And again, very embarrassingly, there are 75% of the companies who are required to give themselves a voluntary quota have set and published no commitment at all, or they had set a target quota of, again, 0%. Again, this is not acceptable anymore in 2021. So there is now, again, legislation being brought on the way to also introduce a mandatory quota also for the executive roles. And so yeah, that's unfortunately necessary, but to get things started, businesses need that little push from government. Yeah.
Absolutely. I can't believe that businesses actually were setting a 0% quota. That's just that's so depressing. Unbelievable. Ranjani, right at the beginning, I spoke about the fact that there are unique challenges, I think, faced by women of colour. And what steps can businesses take, do you think, to improve issues for that particular group, given the challenges that they uniquely have?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, Helen. And as many of you will know, you're in countries where there is a greater move, starting with, of course, gender diversity to now moving towards ethnic diversity and racial richness in our workplaces. I think the first issue I would say, and I can say this as being a person of color myself, is categorization is really tricky, because the issue with, I mean, look, even gender identity has its issues of physical gender versus the gender that you identify with, but it's so complex when it comes to racial and ethnic identity. I'll give you a very small example. I was born and brought up in India. My experiences as now a British Asian living in the UK are going to be uniquely different from someone who happens to be, let's say, a second or third generation immigrant who was born up in France. If you ask me, I would identify myself as Indian Nepalese. If you ask the individual who looks exactly like me, they would first and foremost perhaps identify themselves as French or Swedish, depending on where they grew up. So, this crux of, is my identity my ethnicity, my ethnic origins? Is it my citizenship or my nationality? Is it what I look like and therefore how I behave and the culture within which I've grown up? Is incredibly complex. And I think the first thing we have to do is engage people who represent ethnic minorities to say, look, how do you want us to work with you? Legislation will definitely push us one way. And like Martina said, I would absolutely advocate that the push towards reporting on gender pay gap, reporting on BAME pay gap, for example, or even categorization, those things are very good things to do, because unless we track it, we really don't even have a starting point. But I think understanding that categorization is fraught with error, and actually what you can do is something quite counterproductive, which is end up offending the very people you're trying to help, is I think it has to be the starting point. But what I would say is, in my experience as a practitioner in HR, three things make a big difference to people who represent an ethnic minority. The first tends to be a lack of role models. I think the old proverb is true. You can't be what you can't see. If you can't see people like you, it is very hard to be able to envisage that you can break through that ceiling. So the importance of role models is incredibly important. Secondly, I would say social mobility and ethnic representation often go hand in hand. And without trying to stereotype or generalize, I think statistics will show people who represent or come from ethnic minorities tend to also be often from communities that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So whatever you're doing in representing the efforts of ethnic minorities and their inclusion in the workplace has to go hand in hand with what you're doing on social mobility as well. And thirdly, networks. I think often ethnic minorities are coming from communities where they don't have access to networks and contacts. So allowing them to tap into networks is in my practical experience, a key thing you can do. But I think it is an area of real complex cultural sensitivity, and we need to approach it with that degree of caution.
Thanks, Ranjani. That's really interesting. Now, I just wanted to move back to Martina. Now, obviously, Katja was talking about the fact that improving gender diversity in Germany has been a little bit slower than other parts of mainland Europe, and I always find that really interesting because I kind of look to Germany and see that you have you've got Angela Merkel as your chancellor, and I had thought that it was actually much more progressive. Why do you think it's the case that perhaps moving the dial in Germany is taking such a long time?
Yeah, this is really interesting, isn't it? With Angela Merkel being such a strong leadership personality. I think why Germany is still lagging behind a bit has to do with our culture. In Germany, we have a quite strong conservative culture traditionally. And well, to be precise, in West Germany, we have a quite conservative culture. Because for a very long time, the ideal model of life in West Germany was to be married. Husband goes to work and is responsible for the family income, and the wife stays at home and is responsible for household and kids. Mm-hmm. In East Germany, under the socialist regime, this was actually very different. There it was completely normal for women to have a job as well, and there was a quite good infrastructure for childcare and so on. And interestingly, you still can see these differences today in data, that difference between the west part of Germany and the east part of Germany, because in the east part of Germany, the number of women in leadership roles is significantly higher than in the west part of Germany. So that's quite interesting, and that shows how much culture has an impact on diversity and development opportunities for women. But the good thing is cultures can change. It's slow, but it's possible. And we can see that already now, that the culture in Germany, also in the western part of Germany, is changing as the boomer generation is going to retire and the younger generations get into leadership roles because the younger generations think differently. They are brought up differently. They are more used to working moms. They were brought up by working moms, so this becomes more the mainstream. But it takes time, and we have some more way to go, I think. But eventually, I think there will be progress.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, actually, and it really shows that importance of understanding the culture of where you are, and just how integral culture is to really moving the dial for women and improving gender diversity. I'm going to ask Francesca, because I wanted to just ask as a final point, just to touch on the issue that obviously we're all concerned with, which is the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Martina and Ranjani, what's your views on that? Maybe I can start with Martina. What do you think? How do you think the COVID-19 pandemic is going to impact?
It's actually, I think, a difficult question, because I think as long as schools are closed and kindergartens are closed and there is homeschooling requirement, I think women take on the majority of these additional responsibilities of looking after the kids at home and teaching, taking on the teacher's role and so on. And necessarily have to cut back their own career and own ambitions. But on the long run, I'm optimistic because the new way of working, that mobile working that we are all practicing now, that we are getting used to now, that companies are getting used to now, will provide more opportunities for flexible working hours, for flexible doing work in a more family-friendly way, which may give us more opportunities also to women to better balance family duties and own career ambitions. So I'm optimistic that it may have a positive impact, but it remains to be seen. As at least in Germany, we are currently still in the hard lockdown phase with schools being closed most of the time, and but hoping for the best.
Thank you. And what's your view on that, Ranjani?
So I think some people are answering the poll.
Yeah, I can see it coming through actually now when we're speaking.
Interestingly, about 75% of people, not that it's a very large sample size yet, feel that actually it will have a negative impact on improving gender diversity. And I have to say, on balance, I would probably agree, although I'm generally more optimistic than not. And I would like to be more optimistic about this, but I do think there are some very interesting themes that are happening, and some of those were mentioned. I think when particularly Roxanne was speaking, I think that what the pandemic has highlighted is when there is a global systemic shock across the world, women are still taking the brunt of it, whether it's inclusion in workforce participation. There's, if you look at it pre-pandemic, women accounted for, let's say, 40% of the global workforce. More than 55% of job losses through the pandemic have been female. So, if you look at that, if you look at financial inclusion of women, if you look at just unpaid global care, any country in the world, Western, Eastern, it doesn't matter, women are taking the brunt of global unpaid care, whether it's childcare, elderly care. I think the last statistic I saw was over 75% of global unpaid care is borne by women. So if you look at some of the systemic things that are happening, whilst there is no doubt in my mind, and I love as an HR professional to have seen this global experiment of flexible working that we've been trying to get our boards and management teams to accept, that's been fantastic. So don't get me wrong, I'm very positive about that. It's also been great that I think this world we've opened up of our home lives to our colleagues and managers has made us all a bit more tolerant, a bit more empathetic of the balance we need to strike. But I do think there are some real systemic issues here that the pandemic has tapped into, and we need to be very careful that we don't stall all of this great progress if we don't look at those areas of care. Female workforce participation and legislation has a key role to play in that.
Thank you. That's great. And actually, I can see now the poll has come up. It's still a relatively small sample size, but it's what the poll is suggesting is 72% think it will have a negative impact, but 28% are optimistic like you are, Ranjani, that hopefully things will get better. And I think we all share that optimism. Wanted to say a massive thank you to all of our speakers today. I think we've had a really, really thought-provoking discussion with loads of ideas. And I think what's clear is that we can see that globally, obviously, there are different issues in UK, in mainland Europe, in Asia, and we're all obviously clearly motivated to do our best to improve things. But I think it's really fundamental to your point, Martina, that actually, unless you change the culture, we're not really going to be able to make much of an impact. And hopefully that culture will change and women will be able to have, their fair share of leadership roles and also get their feet under the table as we deserve, I think. So I'd like to conclude by saying a massive thank you to everyone for joining us. It's been wonderful. We could have, I know, definitely kept chatting for longer. There's so much more to discuss. Thanks to all of the panel. Thanks massively to Elaine. Massive thanks to Ranjani and of course Martina for giving up your time today. It's so appreciated. And I hope that all of you listening, wherever you are in the world, have really enjoyed it. And we look forward to welcoming you to another Taylor Wessing event soon. So thank you all very much. Thanks.